Hello, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Be My Guest with me, Rory Smith. Losing a baby during pregnancy still remains today a huge taboo subject around the world. Often it isn't even something people think about until it happens to them. And when it does, often the knowledge, the tools, and the support isn't there because no one expects it to happen to them. Where do you turn to? Who do you talk to? What do you do? It's an unknown and unfamiliar world for many. If there are two parents, they're trying to deal with their loss in different ways, navigating their way through the pain that often they've never felt before, individually or as a couple. In today's episode, I give my platform to a voice that's often not heard in relation to miscarriages, and that is the voice of a man. Let me be clear. This episode is not to undervalue a woman's experience during miscarriage. That is something men will never ever comprehend on any level. It's simply impossible to, and this should not ever be compared. But this episode shines a light on one man's perspective, in the hope that it encourages other men to know that they are not alone. So let's take this story from the start then. Do you remember when you first found out that you were going to be a dad? Do you remember what that felt like?
I remember it as if it were yesterday. My wife and I were sitting in our living room and we were having dinner, an early dinner. And at that point in our relationship, we were accustomed to buying each other gifts. So she came with a little gift bag, and before she presented it, she said, "I have a gift for you." So I'm excited, I'm eating dinner. And she presents me with the gift bag. And so I start opening, taking all of the useless paper that people put in gift bags. And out I pull this little onesie that says, "You're going to be a father." And first I was in shock. And I asked her, what is this? Are you serious? And then she just looked at me and she just had this big smile on her face. And I just popped out of my chair and I ran around the house screaming at the top of my lungs, like, woohoo! And when I finally calmed down, we embraced, we kissed, and I just kept that onesie with me all night. And I would not let go of that thing. I would sleep with it under my pillow. It was the most magical, the most incredible feeling in the world. And now looking back at it, it's like there was this layer of innocence. When I've spoken to people since my experiences that we'll get into, they talk about it in terms of there's a naivete that sort of blankets this phase or how they perceive what this experience will be. And I've come to let go of that language and just consider it's an innocence that comes from a place of really wanting the best that having a child and growing a family has to offer. And there's no reason why going into that at first should be tainted or anyone should have any reason to expect that anything other than that would ever take place.
No, and you never would on your first time. And that led you to going for your first appointment, and the ultrasound was not conclusive. So you were asked back for a second one, and then this is when the physician told you a sentence that would shape your thoughts for years to come.
Yeah, so we're sitting in this little room with this person, and to be honest with you, the memory of that particular doctor's visit is very foggy. I can't tell you if it was a male or female doctor. I can't tell you if like any other descriptors. There were for sure Caucasian, that I remember, and they were for sure dressed appropriately. So I don't even know why I remember those two details, and the fact that we're sitting in a office room with whomever that was, male or female. And in the course of the conversation, and I remember that being said after the pregnancy was confirmed non-viable, and the look of just pain in my wife's face, and me trying to gauge how she was receiving the news, and not even aware that it was having an impact on me also. And then the words came out, oh, don't be surprised if the first pregnancy doesn't stick. And I just took those words and I just tucked them in the back of my mind, because the response to that, the subconscious response to that was, oh, this happens all the time. So if this doctor who I'm placing my trust in is speaking about it with such, I don't even know what the proper term is, but with this sort of carelessness or this carefree attitude, then I really don't have anything to worry about. Let's just chuck that up to the fact that it's our first one. And for sure, we're never going to have to experience whatever this experience is. So not only was I not aware of the impact that it was having on me at the time, but because it was framed in that way, and because my subconscious interpreted what I had heard in that way, it further minimized or derailed any effort that I would ever put into figuring out what was going on inside of me. And it also shaped the way that I responded to my wife's expression of grief.
Because I guess in a way, what they said affected you, but what you're trying to get across is how they said it as well. Because if it's lacking such emotion in how they say it, it almost removes you from the emotion of what's happening.
1000%. There was no sense of empathy. There was no sense of understanding, acknowledging, honoring the loss that my wife and I were feeling at the time. It was said in a very cold manner. And, I've come to this place multiple times of thinking, this is what this person does on a daily basis. And perhaps we were not the first person or family that this news was being conveyed to. Nevertheless, because now I'm on the other side of it, and I've had plenty of opportunity to reflect not just on my own experience, I also am present for people in a healthcare setting when they are experiencing the most devastating days of their lives as it pertains to the loss of their children. This is what I do professionally. I am a support person for people who are experiencing the worst days of their lives, whether it be a neonatal birth, whether it be the news of a very complicated set of outcomes after their child or children are born. And so I inhabit these spaces, albeit not as a medical provider, but as a support person. So not just my own experience, but also my professional experience. I can't walk into a person's space who is dealing with this devastating news and care for them, and then walk into the next space and then just be careless about what I say or how I present myself or what I do. And in a similar way, I think for providers, especially this provider, my wife and I didn't choose to be sitting in their office. That person definitely chose to set themselves up so that people like my wife and I can sit in their office. So that was a choice they made. We did not choose to have a miscarriage. And so all of that taken into account, the way that that was said, it was just so matter of fact. It was just so almost scientific. And, in the scientific mindset from what I've observed, there is not a lot of space or room for emotions because we're dealing with the cold, hard facts. And that was just a cold, hard fact.
So if that was their approach, that is something that you then brought back home. Because I guess in your mind, you're thinking, okay, first one didn't work. I'm sure the second one will. But how different was that pragmatic approach? How different was that to your wife's approach?
Her approach was that now her space, her personal space, her body had to now be invaded by all of these outside pieces of machine in order to process this DENC, which is the procedure that removes the fetus from her body. And so she just felt totally invaded. And also the loss of this thing that we celebrated several weeks prior. And so she is in a cocoon because that's how she grieves. And she goes into herself and she shuts me out. Now, this is the first time and in our marriage that we are experiencing anything to that magnitude. So I hadn't seen her grieve before. And I don't know what to do with her. But not only do I not know what to do with her, my not knowing what to do with her was entirely shaped by the callousness of don't be surprised if the first pregnancy doesn't stick. So if the first pregnancy doesn't stick, why is my wife taking it so hard? Obviously, it happens all the time. So let's just, are you kidding me? We have another opportunity to have more sex. So what are we really devastated for? And I could not understand why she was presenting the way that she was presenting or the ways that she was presenting in light of the cold, hard scientific fact that the first pregnancy often doesn't stick. So it was very difficult for me to figure out what to do with those things. And I have to be honest, Rory, that I mismanaged the care of my wife after our first miscarriage. And it was not until she lashed out at me that my eyes were opened to the reality that she was facing, which for some reason, as a person who, again, works in the healthcare setting and knows how to provide emotional support to people facing the worst days of their lives, I couldn't do that and I couldn't be that for my wife. And it all had to do with this very thin filter, almost a throwaway line in a larger conversation. Don't be surprised if the first pregnancy doesn't stick.
When she lashed out at you, what did she say?
So she had been in her cocoon for several days, weeks even, and we hadn't openly spoken about what had happened. And because I thought she was giving me the silent treatment. And so that started to irritate me. And as a typical guy, I start to create this whole narrative in my head about how she is disrespecting me, how she is being selfish, and it's all about how she and how she and how she. And one morning, as we're getting ready to go to work, and that's the other part of it too, we're the carriers of this news and the loss that we're experiencing, and then we just have to get up the next day and go to work, which is just bizarre. So we're getting ready to go to work. And at that point, the narratives that I was creating in my head, as well as the outward display of my wife's grief in terms of just how secluded she became and how silent she had been, all of that started to touch on aspects of my family life growing up and the dynamics between my parents and how sometimes they would give each other silent treatments. And so I just blew up. And I blew up with the sense of confidence that I have built my argument on solid ground. And there is no way, shape, or form that after I finish saying what I'm saying, that my wife is not going to be like, oh my God, I have been so horrible towards my husband. And it was the exact opposite that took place. After I said what I needed to say, she opened her mouth, and every time she spoke, I just felt smaller and smaller and smaller. And basically what she was saying is, why are you picking on me so much? Why aren't you giving me space to grieve? Why are you trying to invade my space? Like, don't you understand what I'm going through? And the fact is, I did not understand what she was going through. I couldn't understand what she was going through. We were interacting with each other on opposite sides of a very thin, dangerous, toxic veil. And that's just what it was. And so her speaking was what tore that veil apart. And it finally gave me an opportunity to really reassess what had been going on these past several days or weeks after we heard that our pregnancy was not viable. And after I heard those words, don't be surprised if the first pregnancy doesn't stick. And so, like you said, those words have shaped who I am today, my approach to this topic and this issue, and the work that I am trying to do and doing to some regards, and making sure that other people who experience this, particularly fathers, are aware of their own versions of this and how to better support themselves and their partners.
Can you explain a little bit further on another level? Because when your wife said that you're not giving her the space that she needs, but you aren't giving her anything, which in turn could be seen as giving her space, what did she mean? What was she looking for you that you were unable to give her at that time?
That's an excellent question. And to this day, I don't know. I can only surmise that she was perhaps looking for me not to be so intrusive. Over the past year or so, I've developed this image describing how I was towards her. I was like a woodpecker that was constantly just pecking at the cocoon that she had surrounded herself in and encased herself in for protection. And I wasn't trying to get in to connect with her, to soothe the pain that she was feeling, or to even help her carry the pain that she was feeling. Maybe she was looking for me to also say how much it hurt me. I don't know. Those are the things that I've come up with in the times that I've thought briefly about that. But to say that I knew exactly what she had been looking for, because you're right, she was giving me what I perceived to be the silent treatment, and so I would not make an attempt to talk to her. And then when that became too overbearing for me, then I would just lash out at that. So yeah, that's that question has now given me food for thought for the rest of the day.
After some time, Michelle becomes pregnant again, and you go to the ultrasound, but those words that first time from that physician, they're still there subconsciously. They're still embedded in your mind. Don't be surprised if the first pregnancy doesn't stick. So they've gone in and you've been through what you've been through. But the second part of that sentence was there'll be a higher chance the second time. So now we're in the second time. I know that for this time as well, again, you were told that there was no heartbeat. How did that sentence again shape your response, but this time in a different way?
So if the first pregnancy doesn't stick, for sure, the second one is going to stick. And that was the expectation that I had walking into that ultrasound. There was nothing in my mind that said, we're going to go right back to where we were several months earlier. And so to hear those words again, that there is no heartbeat, I'm sorry, guys, there is no heartbeat. I felt this pain in my heart that I had not felt before. And my world started to crumble. For the first time in 2 pregnancies now, I had the awareness that I was actually hopeful that something would have materialized, and that, man, all I wanted to do was be a dad. And so this time coming into it, I knew for sure I was going to get the congratulatory, yeah, congratulations, guy. You are going to be a dad. Mm-hmm. And so when that did not happen, I think I started crying. Mm-hmm. And realizing that, why am I crying? This is Michelle's second time hearing this. Oh my God, this is what she must have felt that first time. Oh my God, Kel, how horrible were you? And so you don't deserve to cry right now, my guy. Because so here's a response to the question that you asked before. Maybe this is what she was looking for. Not necessarily the crying, but the feeling of devastation that I was now feeling in this second event, and how that softened me, how that gripped me and began to do something in me and on me. Maybe that's what my wife was looking for that first time, and I couldn't give it to her. And so now that I found myself in that space, I felt like I was undeserving of being in that space because I couldn't acknowledge how she was when she was in that space several months ago. So then what gives me the right to now all of a sudden be sad and grieve the loss of our second potential child when I'm not the one whose body's going to have to go through another DNC. And she's going to experience it a second time. So I just beat myself up from the inside out. And I tried to better how I presented myself to my wife and that second time around. And I think I did a much better job this time around. And we were able to have some conversation about what we had been experiencing, what it means to us, the impact that it was having on us. And strangely, through these first two events, even though I completely mishandled the first one, I have to say that I am so blessed to have a woman who would even trust me with her body for us to be able to get to that place again.
Wow.
That she trusts me with that she just trusts me in that most intimate way. Because I don't think I would have trusted myself, and I have an incredible woman. I have an incredible wife.
It sounds like it. It certainly does. How did you better present yourself to Michelle this time?
So nothing changed in terms of giving her space. This time I recognized that I needed to give her space. And so I gave her space and I allowed her to be the one to dictate when I can approach and when I should keep my distance. I was no longer creating narratives in my head that were influencing my actions, my disposition around her. I acknowledged that she was dealing with these losses in a totally different way than I could ever know or experience. And it also began to open my eyes to my own experience. So these things were sort of, like I said earlier, they were cutting off the rough edges about me during that first event. And I had become a much softer person. And even though there was this sense of shame and guilt about feeling something this second time around, and I was battling whether or not that was appropriate for me to do, I still felt those things as much as I would allow myself to feel them in this battle within myself.
And that battle, because you were conflicted between what Michelle is feeling and now this time also what you're feeling. And because you're berating yourself, because you feel guilty for the last time, you're now aware that Michelle needs something from you and you're in conversation about what that is. But did that mean that because you were feeling so much guilt, shame about the last time, that it came at a sacrifice to what you needed from yourself?
At the time it did. At the time it totally did. And that was part of the battle. So I would then suppress or try to suppress these deeper emotions of shame and guilt and sadness to present myself in a much better way to her. So I was hypersensitive to what her needs were, constantly asking appropriately, what do you need? Do you want to talk? Like those type of things, and just totally respecting what her response to those questions were. And so, yes, I was suppressing, and suppressing on that end, I would say the other aspect of this is that for all of our pregnancies, and especially after the first miscarriage, she had asked from the first time that we were expecting to not say anything to anyone. And so going through the first miscarriage, I did not have an outlet. I did not have someone to talk to about what had happened. Now that I'm feeling something this second time around, and I need to talk to someone about it other than Michelle, I still had no one to talk to about it. And so that layer of it also resulted in me further suppressing what I was feeling because I couldn't verbalize that in any way to anyone out of respect for what my wife had asked me to do. And this time, for sure, I was not going to go behind her back or do anything that would remotely look like I was not in tune with her and supporting her, especially because of the guilt and shame that I was still feeling as a result of how I presented after the first miscarriage. And so I was very careful to respect what her wishes were. And like I said, to let her dictate how we process through this second miscarriage at the expense of what my own experience was. And like I said, that was the beginning of an awareness that I too have an experience, even though it looks totally different from my wife's experience.
And that's the point, isn't it? Because this conversation it's not about undervaluing the physical aspect of a woman carrying and losing a baby in her own body, because we're men. We will never, ever, ever comprehend that on any level. But because you're both going through pain, and because that pain is different, it doesn't mean that your pain as a man should be disregarded.
1000%. And that took the totality of our experiences for me to also have the same mindset that you just so eloquently expressed. It's never about undervaluing. It's not about demoting. It's not about any of those things. Those paradigms do not fit and they do not work. And it is precisely because these paradigms are the paradigms within which this conversation tends to be had that it creates this tenuous environment between people who are on either side of the spectrum of this argument, of this conversation rather. It's very difficult to have this conversation and not have a large group of people think or assume that as a man, I am saying that my experience equals that of Michelle. And that is precisely what I'm not saying. But because we're having this conversation within that paradigm, it is so hard to parse that out. And so all of these negative comments, or what tends to happen to the man, is that his experience becomes ridiculed, and his experience becomes dismissed, and his experience is ignored. And especially when it comes to a miscarriage, because the miscarriage has occurred before any symptoms of a pregnancy that the man could connect or identify with. It is one thing to put your hand on your wife's belly and feel a kick. or to start talking to the belly and feel a reaction, because that being in there recognizes your voice, and then losing that child. It is a totally different thing when the pregnancy is lost at a moment in the gestational period where nothing to that extent has materialized yet. Michelle hasn't even started showing yet. There are hormonal changes happening in her body, but not to that extent. So one can say, well, what the heck does he have to be sad about? What, like, he's not the one who's going to have to go through these procedures. He's not the one who has to worry about his body rejecting the fetus wherever he may go. He can go play golf. He can go play basketball. He can do whatever. Like, so why is he necessarily sad again? He's not the carrier. And what I've come to land on is that I go back to when Michelle first told me that we were expecting. That moment, that precise moment when I pulled out that onesie and saw the words, "You are going to be a father," a whole universe of dreams and aspirations and possibilities was birthed in my mind. I was going to be a father. Prior to pulling out that onesie, I was just Kelly. I was a husband. I was a son. I was a friend. After pulling out that onesie, a new identity was birthed right then and there. I am going to be a father, and my whole world changed. And so at the loss of a pregnancy to miscarriage, it's not just the pregnancy that's lost. It is all of these nuanced layers of my identity now as a man that is also lost or has also taken an impact. So all of those dreams and aspirations and all of the imaginative things, realities that I began to put any type of value and stock in, all of that disappeared. The moment those words are said, "Sorry, we can't find any heartbeat." So the grief that a father experiences is different or the reasons are different. For sure, they're different. And not to say that Michelle didn't experience that too. But just because I don't have the physical component of my anatomy being invaded, does not mean that my grief is any less valid than my wife's. It just looks different.
And that's the thing, it's not a competition. You feel different things at different times. You need different things from each other at different times. It's about valuing each other's experience, emotions, feelings, and all of that.
Yes.
You both decide then, after some time, to try again for another baby. And that leads to the birth of your first son. That is Julius Camilla in 2020. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And sometime afterwards, you then try for a sibling for him. So here you are. So we're at the part of the story where you thought after the loss of the first pregnancy that that's okay, we can try again. The second pregnancy resulted in another loss, which completely blindsided you because you had built up such hope and expectation for that. And then the third pregnancy resulted in a healthy baby boy. So now Michelle's pregnant for the fourth time, which unfortunately and heartbreakingly for the family ends in a miscarriage again. How different was this miscarriage? Because this is the first one after having a healthy baby boy.
So parts of it felt eerily familiar because we had been there before. And the words of not finding a heartbeat stung as intensely as, for me, the second one, for Michelle, the first two. And so this time the difference was, like you said, we have Julius Camillo. Affectionately, I refer to him as Juki. So we have Juki. And now the questions I'm asking myself are, why am I sad when I already have a living child? Why does this hurt so much? Why am I trying to get another child? Why isn't Juki enough? Michelle is going through this again. Why do I keep putting her in this circumstance? What is it about me that I can't give my wife a healthy enough piece of me so that she doesn't have to go through all of these procedures time and time again? What does enough even mean? Why am I pursuing this? Why are we pursuing this? Why aren't we satisfied? So the level of existential questions intensified because I don't know why my expectations kept getting reset. But after Juki, I for sure thought if there was anything that led to the first two that was misaligned, now that we have gone through a successful pregnancy, delivery, and birth, and we have this beautiful baby boy, then he for sure corrected all of the things that were misaligned. So we are not going to experience any of this stuff ever again. And womp, 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 here we are. And so what is going on inside of me? And then, Rory, to just take it to a more personal level, then I just started thinking about, is this some way, somehow the way that I am, repaying for some of the stupid things I did in my teens, in my 20s? Is this a result of me not respecting or honoring my father because of the messed up relationship that we have? Is this a way of God punishing me? What have I done that now I am bringing my wife into, someone who does not deserve to experience any of the punishment that I'm receiving at this moment? And those, being in that space in my head, took a toll. It took a mental toll. It took an emotional toll. It took a spiritual toll. Because I could not shake those feelings and those questions away. I could not escape not asking myself these questions. And I'm already someone who spends a lot of time in my own head. I'm not going to go as far as to say that I'm a deep thinker, as if not everyone thinks deeply in some aspects of their lives. But I do like to spend a lot of time in my own head trying to understand and analyze not just the surface stuff, but I want to know the why behind the why behind the why. And so I felt trapped in that space as a result of this third miscarriage. And it was a really difficult place to be in.
Did you express any of those questions, any of that blame? Was that expressed in any way to Michelle?
I can't say for sure. By that point, our communication with each other had gotten significantly better as a result of the first two. And I might have expressed some of those things, but I don't think I've ever conveyed to her some of the deeper questions that I was asking myself.
How did it show up emotionally for you?
It definitely complicated the way that I was showing up now for my son, because I would want to feel an attachment to him. And then there was this distance that was keeping me from connecting in the way that I wanted to connect with him. And that's because of the enough question. And I guess part of me at some point, consider the fact that when Juki was born, it was in the middle of a global pandemic in 2020. The state of the world, the United States in particular, with all of the race riots and what have you, all of that was taking a toll on me emotionally, mentally, especially as a brand new father in that context. Just watching the atrocities that were going on that were being projected. I also want to put that out there. The atrocities that were going on, but also the specific ones that were being projected through our news and media outlets, to people who look like me, and to now people who my son looks like. And so here is the greatest joy I have ever experienced in my life, bundled up in this creature that I am now fully responsible for. And my television screen, my alerts on my phone, even the outlets that I would go to for escape, like ESPN and all of the sports outlets, all of that were, all of them were captured by the disturbing headlines of yet another African American man or woman who the police did this to, or who a scared white citizen did this to. And they seemed like they were all dropping like flies. And I'm holding my son in my hands, and I was scared. And I just broke down crying, holding my son one day. And I apologized to him for his existence. And I apologized to him for being born. And I apologized to him for perhaps not being part of his life, because if daddy goes out one day and somebody was having a bad day, they might shoot and kill daddy, and you'll never get to see me, and I'll never get to see you grow up. And I apologize to him for the possibility that his name might one day be trending as a hashtag on then Twitter, and people marching down the street chanting his name, not because he won anything, but because they're crying out for justice for him. And my son was 3 months old at the time, and I'm apologizing to him for these things because of the context in which he was welcomed into the world. And so experiencing that miscarriage now, it just added to that sense of fear and loss, and all of those things just sort of happening at the same time. And like I said, I was not in a good space emotionally. So yeah, it showed up in those type of ways of just being really mindful and careful, but also at a distance and not as closely as I would have wanted it to be.
Because sometimes it is hard to know what to say. And even when you were speaking there, it's hard for me to know what to say because I haven't experienced that fear of walking outside your front door and to hold your son in your arms like that and have to feel that. That is something that I'll never feel. And sometimes you don't know what to say to that. And I suppose in many ways, that's kind of what Michelle was saying the first time. When she said about space, it's not necessarily saying anything, but just being there or admitting that I don't know what to say.
I couldn't agree more. And I think in all of this, there was a moment of redemption, if I can frame it in that way, because that third miscarriage happened at home. And we're getting ready to go to work one morning. It things always seems to happen when we're getting ready to go to work. And this time, we have Juki, and our routine was to take him to my in-laws' house, who were watching him for us. And Michelle was on the main level of our house, and I was upstairs in our room. And I recall her screaming my name in a way that I had never heard my wife's voice reverberate before. And to this day, I don't remember how I got down the steps. I don't know if I jumped from the top step all the way down. I don't know if I ran down. I just know I heard her voice. And when I came to, I was standing in front of the little powder room or semi bathroom that we have on the main level. And the scene that I had in front of me is still very difficult to talk about, even to this day. But there she was. Her body was in the midst of rejecting the life that she once had in her. And she was in such pain. She was in such excruciating pain. And so I went into action mode, and I wanted to be there with her. But then I also remembered we have Juki upstairs, and he does not need to be here to hear his mother crying in that way. And I won't be able to both care for him and also care for her at the same time. So I had a very difficult decision to make, which was the right decision. And it was to leave Michelle in the process that she was in, because there was nothing that I could do for her tangibly at that moment to help ease her pain or accelerate her process, I couldn't do anything. What I could do was to get my son ready, take him to his in-laws, and then come back and try to be as helpful to my wife as possible. And so that's exactly what I did. and I got him ready, and it pained me to have to tell her as I'm walking out of the house, babe, I will be right back, and just leave her in the midst of what she was experiencing, to then take the 10-minute drive to my in-laws. And thankfully it's only 10 minutes. But then once I got there, they didn't know that she was pregnant. So I couldn't let on to the fact that anything was going on. In their mind, she had already gone to work, and I was dropping Juki off because I was working a little later that day. So I couldn't convey any of what was going on to my mother-in-law at the time. So I leave home feeling horrified and devastated that I have to leave my wife. I get to my in-laws, and I have to put on this facade that everything is fine, everything is okay. I have to decelerate my body so that I'm not betraying the facade of tranquility and stability, and everything is fine and dandy. So I even have to have small talk with my in-law, knowing that every second that I'm spending here in this small talk, my wife is in the bathroom by herself and her body's rejecting who would have been our kiddo. So I finally make my way out, and I speed back home, and I find my wife in the same spot that I left her. And she is on the bathroom floor, and there is blood everywhere, and she is crying, and she is in pain. And I was horrified, and I couldn't do anything. So then I just laid on the floor next to her, and I started crying with her. And then a little bit had gone by, and she was feeling really hot. And so she asked me to go get a fan that was in the room where I am now sitting having this conversation with you. And she didn't know how much of a lifeline she was throwing me, because now I could do something. I could tangibly do something. And I came and grabbed that fan, and I plugged it in, and I must have repositioned that fan 6 or 7 times just to make sure that not an inch of her body was not getting ventilated. And then just laid on the floor next to her again until she conveyed that the process had finished, and all she wanted to do was just get up, go take a shower, and go to bed. So I helped her up the steps. I told her she didn't have to worry about cleaning downstairs, which is what she wanted to do. And I told her, I got it. You go take a shower, go lay down. I'll take care of all the other stuff. And that's what I did. So in a way, with the help of some very good friends, they've helped me realize that the way that I presented in that moment was exactly what she needed. And even though I couldn't do anything, at that moment, it wasn't about doing as much as it was about fully being there with my wife, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, fully filling in that space with my presence alongside her in this experience, and conveying without any words that she was not alone in what she was going through. And even though it manifested differently, her body was feeling pain, not mine. But I was as hurt and grieved as her at that moment. And it took me a long time to finally wrap my arms around that and say, I think they're right. I think they're right.
And that is the space that Michelle was talking about. Do you talk with Michelle about the miscarriages now?
We have spoken about it. We have spoken about them. We have gotten a little better about talking more extensively about them or a particular one. The one that we have not spoken extensively about is this one that I just mentioned, because it is still very difficult for her to talk about, as it is for me. Mm-hmm. But I've spoken about it enough with other people that it gets a little more tolerable to go back to that space. Mm-hmm. Just a couple of nights ago, in fact, I just asked her a question, just trying to get the chronology right in my head, knowing that we would be having this conversation, you and I. And that sort of opened the door for us to talk about one of our miscarriages. And I had a chance to hear from her, in her own words, what she was thinking, what she was feeling, and the impact that it's had on her. Mm-hmm. So we don't make a conscious effort to talk about it, but we also don't shy away necessarily from talking about it, and when the opportunities show up organically.
Mm-hmm. With your own grief, because from my experience of talking to people who have lost someone, that grief rarely goes away, if ever. But a lot of people say that they find ways to live around their grief. How do you do that?
So once we got to the other side of creating the family that we wanted, I spent some time with this idea in my mind about creating a space for fathers who have gone through a similar experience, for them to find a space to openly talk about what their experience is, or their experience was or is. And I bounced around the idea in my head for a while. And one day I just decided, you know what, Cal, just pull the trigger. And so the Miscarriage Dad was birthed as a result of that. And that is my online handle in this space. So I started an Instagram platform, and then I decided I am just going to start a podcast called The Miscarriage Dads. The Miscarriage Dad at first. So once I launched the Instagram page, I was pleasantly surprised by the number of people who showed their support for the space, who were actually blown away, because that made them realize that there was no such space for men in particular, and talking about this thing from the perspective of the male partner. And what was so disheartening for me when I was preparing to launch the podcast and the Instagram page was that when I looked for that kind of space here in the United States, I could not find any. But I did find, and this was the encouraging part, I did find other spaces and platforms in Australia. I found other spaces and platforms in the UK. So that helped me realize that this is an untapped space in the United States of America. In the United States of America. Anyway, that's a different conversation. So I launched the Instagram page, and then a friend of mine who I went to grad school with, she commented on one of my posts when introducing myself as the Miscarriage dad, and she said, "You should talk to my husband, Chris." And Chris and I and his wife Amber, we were all in grad school together. And so when she said that, I reached out to her immediately and I said, "Why do I need to reach out to Chris?" And that's when she told me that they had recently experienced a miscarriage. So I'm talking on the phone with her as she's telling me her story, and Chris, her husband, was sleeping because they had become parents and to their second child. And so Chris wakes up and I tell Amber, "Give that man the phone." So Chris and I start talking, and he shares his story from his perspective. And then I told him about what my platform was about and what my plans were, and he was so invigorated by that he decided that he wanted to jump on and be a part of it by supporting in any way that he could. And we bounced around the idea of doing the podcast together and co-hosting this space for men. And so that's what we've done. We launched the podcast October of last year. I felt as a fellow podcaster, I don't know if you've gone through this before, but the level of excitement about the Instagram page, or that I received in the Instagram page when I first launched it, I thought that would translate over to listeners, and that had not been the case. And so I started to feel disappointed and disheartened by that. And then towards the end of last year, beginning of this year, I started getting random messages from men whom I've never met before, but who met me and Chris through our podcast. And they sent me emails and direct messages on Instagram saying how thankful and how grateful they were, because they had also gone through this experience recently, and they looked for something that could speak to their experience. And the things that they found were mostly geared toward the mother's experience. And one of them mentioned that he did find something that kind of talked about it, but not really. And just the vibe that he got from that resource was not what he was looking for, until he found our little old tucked in the back podcast called the Miscarriage Dads. And he said, "Thank you to the both of you, because in hearing you talk about your experiences, it gave me language to put around my own experience and language to talk to my partner about my experience." And that's when I experienced yet another transformation and realized it's not about the number of subscribers. It's not about the number of listeners. It's about the handful of people whose experience could have been markedly different had they not found our space and being and counting one person who found our podcast as helpful as if that was the equivalent of 10,000 subscribers and listeners.
And I guess in many ways, when Michelle was going through that third miscarriage, it was when you learnt, and you said during this interview, you had to be there so that she didn't feel alone, which is the exact same space that you're now creating for other men.
Yes, I think for men, generally speaking, there's obviously exceptions to every general statement. But I think generally for men, we are wired to assess our value, our worth, how to perceive our space, how to carve our space and the world and the spaces that we inhabit in terms of what we are able to do. It is very task oriented. Even the ways that we think about our roles as husbands and fathers in particular, it's all about providing and it's all about protecting. And it's all based on our strength as men. And there is nothing wrong with that. I think that these things are obviously very helpful in a healthy perspective. Obviously, there are, again, the exceptions. What is not overly emphasized for us men, generally speaking, is the other side of the coin, which is simply inhabiting a space without having to do anything and just simply being there. We talk about it, particularly in the fatherhood space, about just be there for your children. The best present you can give your child is your presence. And while that sounds incredible, in these types of moments and experiences, it is one of the most difficult things to do. And again, even in the language that we use around it, that I just said, it's all about doing. So to be there, to simply be there, to be settled within oneself, to have the confidence about oneself that one's presence is precisely what is needed at this moment, at this time, without necessarily having to do anything tangible, is very difficult for many men. And the irony of this whole thing for me is that professionally, that is how I present myself for people in the hospital setting. And it was extremely difficult for me to present myself or to accept that presenting myself for my wife in that moment in our home was the right thing to do. And again, it was the help of fellow dads who have also gone through this experience that helped me embrace the value of being there. I didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to do anything, although I was so thankful when she asked me to get that fan. And that's precisely where I want to land. It is two sides of the same coin. The doing does not come and should not come at the exclusion of being, and being shouldn't come at the exclusion of doing. It is the same thing. It's just leaning into what is necessary in that moment in order to establish and maintain that necessary connection with the person who is grieving or who is in need of connection in some way at that moment. And whether that is doing something, whether that is simply being there, it's equally as valuable. And that has helped me out a lot.